Deep inside the mesa at Skinwalker Ranch, a drill bit slammed into something it could not penetrate. The machinery pushed harder, the pressure climbed. But instead of cutting through the obstruction, the drill appeared to slide away from it. Then researchers approached the same underground target from another direction. The result was even stranger. The drill moved in the opposite direction. For Travis Taylor and his team, this was no longer simply a strange reading on a screen. Something beneath the rock was physically interfering with the investigation. And then fragments began appearing in the drilling spoils. Tiny pieces of metal, material that researchers believed they had scraped from whatever was buried inside the mesa. When those fragments were analyzed, the investigators reported that their composition and construction showed similarities to materials used in spacecraft heat protection systems. History has documented the team's discovery of an impenetrable underground object and the recovery of metal fragments from what the investigators interpreted as a massive dome-shaped anomaly. That sounds like the discovery of a UFO. But there is a crucial problem. They never recovered an intact spacecraft. The evidence does not scientifically establish that an extraterrestrial vehicle is buried inside Skinwalker Ranch. What researchers actually found was an underground anomaly that appeared unusual, fragments that they considered unusual, and a series of measurements that raised questions they could not immediately answer. And that distinction may be what makes the story even more fascinating, because if the object really is artificial, somebody or something put it there. And if it is not artificial, then the researchers need to explain why a natural formation produced such strange results. The mystery began years earlier, when investigators became interested in the massive mesa bordering the ranch. For decades, stories had circulated about caves, underground structures, secret investigations, and even alleged objects hidden inside the formation. Most of those stories were difficult to verify. Rumors are easy to create in a place already famous for unexplained phenomena. But the modern investigation approached the problem differently. Instead of asking what people believed was inside the mesa, researchers used ground-penetrating radar and other subsurface techniques to search for measurable anomalies. The scans produced something remarkable. A large underground feature appeared to stand out from the surrounding geology. Then another, and another. The team began interpreting the pattern as evidence of large buried objects. History later described the investigation as finding evidence of massive metallic objects beneath the mesa, and subsequently drilling specifically in search of one of them. That changed everything, because now the question wasn't simply whether the ranch had strange stories. There was a physical target, a location, a depth, something the researchers could attempt to reach. So the drill went in, and the deeper it traveled, the more complicated the picture became. The drilling operation encountered extremely hard material that resisted the equipment. The drill operators reported that the obstruction seemed to redirect the drill path rather than simply allowing the bit to pass through it. From different approaches, the apparent direction of deflection changed, leading the investigators to consider whether the target had a curved or dome-like shape. Then came the metallic fragments. That was the moment the investigation acquired a physical clue. The fragments were taken for analysis, and according to the team, the results showed similarities to materials used in spacecraft heat shields. But similar materials can have many origins. Advanced alloys are manufactured on Earth. Industrial equipment can produce metal debris. Drilling itself can introduce contamination, and geological formations can contain unusual concentrations of elements. So the material alone could not identify the object. Yet there was something about its location that made the discovery difficult to dismiss. The fragments were coming from deep inside a mountain, not from the surface, not from an abandoned building, not from an obvious piece of machinery. They were emerging from a borehole aimed at a subsurface anomaly. And then the investigation uncovered another detail that would make the mystery even stranger. A coin. A 1964 nickel was reportedly recovered from the same general drilling area. First glance, that should have made the mystery less extraordinary. A coin is human. It proves nothing about aliens. But the archaeologist working with the team offered an intriguing interpretation. Dated coins can be used as markers at archaeological excavation sites, potentially indicating that someone had previously worked in the area. If that explanation applied here, it would mean the modern investigation might not have been the first time humans disturbed this part of the mesa. And suddenly, the most disturbing question was no longer simply, is there a UFO buried inside Skinwalker Ranch? It became something much harder to answer. Who was looking inside the Mesa before Travis Taylor arrived, and what did they already know was down there? The possibility that someone had already disturbed the Mesa decades before Travis Taylor arrived was impossible to prove from a single coin, but it was impossible to ignore. Because the deeper the modern team investigated, the more the Mesa seemed to resist a simple explanation. The original drilling campaign had already produced an extraordinary result. History documented that the team encountered a void containing an impenetrable object and later recovered metal fragments from what investigators interpreted as a massive dome buried inside the Mesa. But there was something even more important about the discovery. The object wasn't simply detected, it was targeted. Researchers had a specific location in the subsurface where their instruments suggested something different from the surrounding rock. That gave them a rare opportunity. Instead of relying entirely on eyewitness testimony, they could make a prediction. If the anomaly was real, drilling toward it should eventually produce physical evidence. And that's exactly what made the results so difficult to dismiss. The drill encountered an obstruction, not soft soil, not an ordinary cavity, something that the drilling equipment could not simply pass through. When operators attempted different approaches, the drill rod reportedly moved downward and then upward as if it were following the contour of an object. The investigators interpreted that pattern as evidence that the obstruction had an oval or dome-like shape. But an interpretation is not an identification. The drill did not announce that it had struck a spacecraft. It did not reveal an engine. It did not expose a cockpit. It simply encountered something, and then came the fragments. Tiny pieces of metal were recovered from the material removed by the drill. The team sent those pieces to the University of Utah for analysis. According to history, the investigators were surprised by similarities between the elements in the fragments and materials used by NASA to protect spacecraft from the extreme heat of atmospheric re-entry. That sounds extraordinary, but there is a crucial scientific problem. Materials used in spacecraft are not exclusive to spacecraft. Titanium, aluminum, and other high-performance materials have countless terrestrial applications. A similarity in composition cannot establish where a fragment came from. So the result created a question, not an answer. What was the source of the metal? And that question became even more complicated when researchers returned to the Mesa with new technology. In Season 4, history described the team discovering new evidence of massive metallic objects beneath the Mesa. Soon afterward, they began drilling specifically in search of a metal object. The timing was significant. The investigation was no longer simply revisiting an old anomaly. It was building on previous measurements. Researchers believed the new data could help identify where additional objects were located, and if multiple scans independently pointed toward the same underground region, the probability of coincidence would become increasingly difficult to ignore. But there was another possibility. What if the Mesa contained several unrelated anomalies? What if the radar was detecting layers of dense rock? What if mineral deposits were creating the appearance of metal? What if previous human activity had left behind fragments? These explanations might sound less exciting, but they had to be considered, because every scientific investigation begins with the possibility that the strange thing has an ordinary cause. Then the team began testing those possibilities. They mapped the terrain. They compared subsurface measurements. They drilled, they analyzed samples, and they returned to the same locations repeatedly. Meanwhile, the sky above the Mesa was producing its own mystery. History's Season 4 episode descriptions specifically connect the drilling operation with experiments that produce startling UFO sightings over the ranch. One episode was devoted to drilling for a metal object buried inside the Mesa, while another experiment at the Triangle produced unusual aerial phenomena that created an unsettling coincidence. Researchers were looking for something beneath the mountain. At the same time, strange objects were appearing above it. Could those events be connected? There was no established proof that they were. But if the same location repeatedly produced anomalies both above and below ground, the relationship became worth investigating. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. Because if the underground object were merely an old piece of machinery, it could explain the metal. If the strange material were simply industrial debris, it could explain the fragments. If the aerial sightings were ordinary aircraft or atmospheric phenomena, they could be explained separately. But what if the evidence was not separate? What if the underground anomaly and the aerial activity were part of the same phenomenon? That possibility would change the entire investigation. The Mesa would no longer be just a place where something mysterious was buried. It could be the physical center of whatever was happening at Skinwalker Ranch. And researchers had one way to test that idea. They needed to find out whether the strange activity in the sky changed when the team interacted with the ground. Because if an experiment below the Mesa triggered a measurable response above it, coincidence would become much harder to argue. And once the researchers began looking for that connection, they discovered that the most important clue might not be metallic at all. It might be something much smaller, something they could hold between two fingers. A fragment of material that appeared ordinary until they looked at it under a microscope. The fragment looked almost ordinary until the researchers examined its surface. Under magnification, the material revealed a pattern that did not resemble the surrounding sandstone. One side appeared glazed, while the other showed a distinctive cross-hatched texture. The team interpreted those characteristics as signs of a manufactured ceramic rather than a naturally occurring piece of rock. That changed the investigation. Metal can occur naturally. Unusual minerals can occur naturally. Even strange shapes can be produced by geological processes. But a deliberately patterned composite material raises a different question. Who manufactured it? According to Travis Taylor's later description of the discovery, the material came from deep inside the mesa after the drill encountered an extremely hard target. He said laboratory specialists concluded that the material had been sintered and manufactured in a way comparable to heat-resistant tiles used on spacecraft, while also emphasizing that its chemical composition was not identical to those materials. That distinction is critical. The material was not identified as a spacecraft component. It was not proven to be extraterrestrial. But investigators believed it showed characteristics associated with engineered high-temperature materials. And then they found something even stranger. The ceramic was tested under a scanning electron microscope. At first, everything looked normal. Then the electron beam began interacting with the sample. Tiny damaged regions appeared to develop on the surface. Researchers watched as the structure changed under the beam. Then they stopped the exposure. And according to the footage and transcripts from the investigation, the damaged areas appeared to regenerate. The team described it as the material apparently healing itself. If that observation holds up under independent, it would be extraordinary. But once again, extraordinary does not automatically mean extraterrestrial. Materials can behave unexpectedly under electron beams. Microscopic samples can charge, heat, migrate, deform, or undergo structural changes that create unusual images. The real scientific question is whether the effect can be reproduced under controlled conditions by researchers who are not expecting to see it. That is the standard the Mesa material would eventually have to survive. But there was another clue. The researchers tested the ceramic's elemental composition. The analysis identified familiar elements including titanium, calcium, iron, aluminum, and vanadium. None of those elements is mysterious. All exist naturally on Earth. Several are widely used in industrial and aerospace materials. But the combination, and the way the material appeared to have been manufactured, was what attracted the investigators' attention. Vanadium was particularly interesting because the team had previously detected it in metallic fragments recovered from the Mesa, two different materials, recovered from the same general underground investigation, both containing components that could be associated with advanced engineering. That does not prove they came from the same object. But it created a tantalizing possibility. What if the metal fragments and ceramic pieces were not separate discoveries? What if they were parts of one structure? Think about a spacecraft. A vehicle designed to survive extreme temperatures might require multiple layers, a strong structural material, a protective coating, heat-resistant ceramics, specialized composites. If the Mesa contained fragments of something engineered for extreme thermal conditions, the materials might be exactly what researchers would expect from a technologically advanced object. But there was a problem. The investigators still didn't have the object, only pieces, and pieces can lie. A fragment cannot tell you its original purpose. A piece of ceramic does not tell you whether it protected a spacecraft, an industrial furnace, a missile, a laboratory instrument, or something else entirely. That is why context became everything. Where exactly was the material found? How deep was it? Was it embedded in the target? Was it mixed with ordinary drilling debris? Could the drill itself have produced it? And could contamination have entered the sample during extraction? Those questions became especially important because the drilling equipment had already suffered significant damage. A tungsten carbide drill bit had been sent into the Mesa. The team reported encountering material so hard that the drilling process became extremely difficult. Later investigators wondered whether the strange ceramic could have been responsible for the extraordinary resistance encountered underground. If that connection were real, it would be fascinating. The material could potentially explain why the drill struggled, but if the ceramic was manufactured, why was it there? And if it formed part of a larger object, what was that object doing hundreds of feet below the surface? The mystery became even more complicated when researchers examined the possibility of radioactive material. Reports from the investigation described elevated radiation readings associated with some of the recovered material, while later discussions emphasized that the reported levels were low and required careful interpretation. Again, radiation does not mean alien. Natural rocks can be radioactive. Industrial materials can contain radioactive elements. Even ordinary background radiation varies from place to place. But when an unusual material recovered from an underground anomaly produces a measurable change on a radiation detector, researchers have another variable to investigate. Now there were multiple properties to explain: hardness, manufacturing patterns, chemical composition, electromagnetic behavior, possible radiation, and an apparent microscopic response to an electron beam. Each observation could have an ordinary explanation. But if all of them belonged to the same material, the combined puzzle became increasingly difficult to simplify. Then Travis Taylor and the team began considering a much bigger possibility. Maybe the material wasn't merely debris from something buried in the mesa. Maybe it was part of the mechanism itself, something designed to withstand extraordinary forces, something capable of interacting with energy, something that had survived underground for an unknown amount of time. And if the material really was engineered, there was only one question that mattered now. What kind of machine would require a material like this, and why would part of it be buried inside Skinwalker Ranch? The possibility that the ceramic was connected to the object changed the meaning of everything the drill had encountered, because the material wasn't simply strange. According to Travis Taylor's later account, laboratory specialists concluded that the fragments appeared to have been manufactured using a process similar to the way heat-resistant spacecraft tiles are produced, even though the chemical composition was not identical to space shuttle tiles. That distinction is critical. The investigators had not discovered a confirmed spacecraft component. They had discovered a manufactured material buried deep inside the mesa that appeared to share certain engineering characteristics with aerospace heat protection materials. And that created a far more precise question. Why would someone manufacture a material like this and bury it hundreds of feet underground? The answer became even harder to find when researchers examined the material under an electron microscope. The microscope was not simply taking a photograph. It was bombarding the sample with electrons. And something unexpected happened. Tiny holes appeared across the surface. The researchers watched them change. Then they switched the electron beam off. When they examined the sample again, the damaged regions appeared to have returned toward their previous state. The team described the effect as the material seemingly repairing itself. That sounds almost impossible. But the word impossible is dangerous in science. A microscopic sample can respond to an electron beam in complicated ways. Charging, heating, structural rearrangement, and imaging artifacts can all create effects that look extraordinary. So the observation needed replication. And Travis Taylor himself has emphasized the importance of reproducing unusual results before treating them as established discoveries. In a later discussion of the ceramic, he described unusual behavior but stressed that repeated testing was necessary before drawing firm conclusions. That caution matters, because the most spectacular interpretation is not always the correct one. Still, the material had another property that caught the investigators' attention. Its elemental composition included titanium, calcium, iron, aluminum, and vanadium according to the team's reported laboratory testing. Vanadium was particularly interesting because earlier metallic fragments from the mesa had also contained vanadium. Again, that does not prove the fragments came from the same object. But it creates a potential connection worth testing. Two unusual materials, one underground location, one drilling operation, and both containing elements that could occur in engineered high-strength materials. Then came the most important question. Could the ceramic explain what happened to the drill? The answer might be hidden in the physical properties of the material. The drilling team had encountered something so hard that the equipment was severely damaged. Later accounts from the investigation described the drill bit being destroyed after encountering the hard target deep inside the mesa. If the ceramic was responsible, then the strange material wasn't merely sitting near the target. It could have formed part of the target itself. Imagine a large underground structure covered in a material designed to resist extreme heat and mechanical stress. A drill would not necessarily behave as it would against ordinary sandstone. It might grind, it might slip, it might overheat, it might lose its cutting surface, and fragments could potentially break away. That would explain why the drilling operation recovered material from the exact region where the drill encountered extraordinary resistance. But it still wouldn't answer the biggest question. What was beneath the ceramic? A protective layer implies something lies underneath. A spacecraft heat shield protects a vehicle. A furnace lining protects a chamber. An industrial coating protects machinery. So if the mesa really contained an engineered ceramic layer, researchers needed to know what it was protecting. That possibility made the underground radar image suddenly much more interesting. The team's earlier scans had suggested a large structure, described in the investigation as roughly 400 feet long and potentially metallic, with smaller objects surrounding it. A structure that large would not be explained by one tiny fragment. The ceramic would have to be part of something much bigger. And if the radar interpretation was accurate, the object might extend far beyond the original drilling point. That was the point where the UFO theory became almost impossible for the investigators to ignore, not because they had proven a UFO was buried there. They hadn't, but because several clues seemed to converge on the same possibility: a large underground anomaly, metallic signatures, manufactured ceramic, extreme resistance to drilling, fragments recovered from the target area, and reports of unusual activity above the mesa. Each clue could have a conventional explanation, But the investigators were no longer looking at one clue. They were looking at the combination, and combinations create patterns. The problem was that the pattern still lacked its most important piece, the object itself. Researchers had reached the edge of it. They had recovered fragments. They had studied material. They had mapped the surrounding area. But they had not opened the mountain and looked directly at whatever was buried inside. That meant the mystery could still collapse under closer examination. The UFO could become a geological formation. The spacecraft material could become an industrial composite. The underground debris field could become fractured rock. Or something far stranger could finally emerge. And the team had one remaining strategy. If the horizontal boreholes could not reach the heart of the anomaly, they would change direction. Instead of approaching the object from the side, they could drill toward it from above. Straight down, toward the center, toward whatever had been resisting their equipment. And this time, they weren't simply searching for fragments. They were trying to reach the thing itself. The decision to approach the anomaly from above changed the investigation completely. Instead of trying to slip underneath the suspected object, the team could attempt to come directly toward it, straight through the mesa, straight toward the location where the earlier drilling had encountered the mysterious hard target. The logic was simple. If the anomaly was real, the drill should eventually reach it. And if it was artificial, the team might finally recover something substantial enough to identify it. This was no longer about a tiny fragment. The objective was the source. By this point, the investigation had accumulated years of measurements. History's later seasons continued to describe new ground-penetrating radar results, additional buried object investigations, and drilling operations aimed at possible targets inside the mesa. But every new experiment created another problem. The underground environment was not simple. Rock density changed, layers overlapped, minerals altered the signals. And every drilling operation disturbed the very material researchers were trying to study. That meant the team had to move carefully. A drill can reach something hidden beneath the ground, but once it destroys or mixes the surrounding material, reconstructing the original context becomes difficult. For that reason, every fragment mattered, every piece was evidence, and every piece could also be misleading. Then came the ceramic. The material extracted from the mesa became important enough that later investigations returned to it repeatedly. History's 2025 and 2026 episode descriptions specifically identify the ceramic material as a major focus of new scientific testing. That was significant because the ceramic offered something the radar could not. A radar image shows a structure, a sample reveals chemistry, and chemistry can be tested independently. Researchers could ask what elements were present. They could examine the microscopic structure. They could test the material's response to heat, electricity, radiation, and other conditions. If the same unusual properties appeared repeatedly, the evidence would become much stronger. But the ceramic also created a potential trap. Once researchers began thinking about spacecraft materials, every unusual property could be interpreted through that lens. That is confirmation bias. You find something strange. You develop a theory. Then every new observation begins looking like support for the theory. Good science has to fight that instinct. The researchers needed to ask not only how could this material be from a spacecraft, they also needed to ask, what terrestrial process could produce the same result? That question might be less exciting, but it is essential. Because if a conventional explanation works, it should be preferred until evidence forces researchers beyond it. And the mesa was producing enough uncertainty that multiple explanations remained possible. Maybe the object was human-made. Maybe it was geological. Maybe old drilling had created misleading underground features. Maybe the material came from industrial activity. Or perhaps the anomaly represented something genuinely unknown. There was no shortcut. The evidence had to decide. Meanwhile, the investigation above ground was producing another intriguing pattern. The team repeatedly reported unusual aerial objects during experiments around the ranch. History's official episode descriptions connect Mesa investigations with startling UFO observations during aerial experiments. That raised a tantalizing possibility. Could something underground be influencing what happened above it? It was an extraordinary hypothesis, but extraordinary hypotheses require extraordinary controls. The team needed synchronized instruments. They needed multiple observation points. They needed independent confirmation. And ideally, they needed experiments that could be repeated without the researchers knowing when the anomaly would appear. Otherwise, a coincidence could easily become a supposed connection. This is where Skinwalker Ranch becomes scientifically fascinating. The investigators were not simply searching for something strange. They were attempting to determine whether different anomalies shared a measurable signature. If an aerial object appeared and the instruments around the mesa changed at precisely the same time, that would be worth investigating. If the underground material responded to a controlled stimulus, that could reveal a physical mechanism. If neither occurred consistently, the larger theory would weaken. And then the team encountered another challenge. The suspected object beneath the mesa appeared to be enormous. According to descriptions associated with the investigation, the underground anomaly was interpreted as a large, elongated structure with smaller anomalies around it. But size estimates from subsurface imaging are not the same as photographs. A radar reflection can represent a boundary. A dense geological layer can appear enormous. Multiple reflections can merge. The shape can be reconstructed incorrectly, so researchers needed physical confirmation. That meant drilling closer and closer, until the drill reached the point where the radar prediction could either be confirmed or completely destroyed. Then something unexpected happened. The deeper the operation went, the more researchers began noticing relationships between the drilling activity and unusual environmental measurements. The timing appeared significant. But timing alone is not causation. A thunderstorm can coincide with a radio disturbance. A nearby transmitter can coincide with equipment interference. A drilling machine can generate electromagnetic noise, and an instrument can react to its own environment. The team therefore had to separate genuine anomalies from the fingerprints of their own equipment. That may have been the hardest part of the entire investigation, because the deeper they dug, the more technology they brought with them. And technology creates signals. Sometimes the investigator becomes part of the experiment. But if the strange readings survive those controls, then the mystery would become much harder to explain. The question would no longer be whether the team had found something unusual. It would be whether the Mesa itself was interacting with the experiment. And if that was happening, the object beneath the rock might not simply be something that had been buried there. It might still be doing something. The drilling operation had reached a point where every explanation carried a problem. If the anomaly was geological, why did the drilling behavior appear so unusual? If it was human-made, why was it buried so deeply? If the fragments were industrial material, how did they become associated with the underground target? And if the object really was technological, why had nobody been able to reach it? The questions kept multiplying. Then the investigation returned to the ceramic. By 2025 and 2026, the material had become important enough to receive its own series of experiments. History's official episode listings describe new scientific tests on ceramic material extracted from the Mesa, followed by additional tests producing evidence interpreted by the team as buried objects and a new drilling operation aimed at a possible target. That development matters because it moved the story away from the original discovery. The researchers were no longer simply asking what the material looked like, they were asking what it could do. Could it withstand extreme conditions? Could it interact with electromagnetic energy? Could its unusual properties explain the resistance encountered during drilling? Could it somehow be connected to the other anomalies observed around the ranch? Those questions were far more difficult than identifying the material's elements. Because a list of elements tells you what something contains, it does not necessarily tell you what the object was designed to accomplish. A titanium alloy can be used in aircraft. It can also be used in industrial machinery. A ceramic can protect spacecraft. It can also protect furnaces. The same chemistry can serve completely different purposes. That is why the physical structure becomes so important. And if the Mesa material really was manufactured under unusual conditions, its microscopic architecture could reveal more than its chemical composition ever could. The investigators therefore continued examining the samples. But there was another mystery developing around the Mesa. The underground anomalies appeared to be changing the way researchers thought about the entire landscape. Earlier scans had suggested buried structures. Later investigations continued producing possible underground targets. And History's 2026 episode descriptions show the team conducting new tests in the Mesa and then beginning a drilling operation to uncover a possible object. This was significant. The investigation was not over. The researchers still believed the subsurface deserved direct examination. And every attempt to reach the target created another opportunity for the hypothesis to survive or fail. That is the real test, not whether a theory sounds convincing, whether it predicts something that can actually be found. Suppose the team predicts a buried object at a specific location. They drill. If they find nothing, the hypothesis weakens. If they find ordinary rock, it weakens. If they find an unexpected material exactly where the instruments predicted it, the hypothesis becomes stronger. That is how the mystery can be transformed into science. But the Mesa presented another complication. The suspected object was not necessarily sitting in an empty cavity. It could be embedded directly into the surrounding rock. That would explain why drilling from one direction produced resistance. It could also explain why fragments appeared in the drilling spoils. And if the object had been there for decades, or far longer, the surrounding geology might have altered its surface. A metallic structure buried underground would not necessarily look like a machine anymore. Corrosion, pressure, mineral deposition, chemical reactions, all could transform its appearance. A spacecraft that entered the ground thousands of years ago would not necessarily resemble a spacecraft today. But that is only a thought experiment. There is no established evidence that an ancient spacecraft crashed into the Mesa. The investigation has not demonstrated such a timeline, and that uncertainty is important. Because the most dramatic version of the story requires assumptions that the physical evidence has not yet proved. Still, the possibility of a technological object remained part of the discussion because the team had encountered something they considered unusually resistant, unusually shaped, and associated with unusual materials. Then the sky added another layer. The ranch has produced repeated reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. And history's documentation includes episodes in which unusual objects appeared during controlled experiments near the Mesa. Could those events be connected to the underground anomaly? That question remains unanswered, but researchers could test it, monitor the sky, monitor the Mesa, record electromagnetic conditions, record radio frequencies, track radar, synchronize the timestamps, then compare the data. If the same signal appears simultaneously in multiple systems, the evidence becomes much stronger. And if the relationship repeats, something genuinely interesting may be happening. But if the connection appears only once, coincidence remains a powerful explanation. That is the line the investigation has been approaching for years. And perhaps the most important revelation is not that Travis Taylor has proven a UFO is hidden beneath Skinwalker Ranch. He hasn't. The evidence does not justify that conclusion. What he and the team have done is something more cautious and potentially more important. They have identified a physical mystery. They have extracted material. They have tested it. They have returned to the location. They have generated new hypotheses. And they have continued trying to falsify their own explanations. Now the final question becomes brutally simple. After all the scans, all the drilling, all the fragments, and all the experiments, is there actually a machine beneath the Mesa? Because if the answer is yes, the next problem is even bigger. Who built it? How did it get there? And why has it remained hidden beneath Utah's desert for so long? Those questions cannot be answered by a radar image. They cannot be answered by a theory. And they cannot be answered by a television episode. They require the one thing the Mesa has denied investigators from the beginning: direct access to whatever is actually inside. And that is why the next drill hole may be more important than every strange photograph, every mysterious light, and every unexplained story that came before it. Because eventually, the mountain has to give up something that cannot be interpreted from a distance. Something physical, something identifiable, something that can be placed on a laboratory table. And if that day comes, the question won't be whether the object looks like a UFO. The question will be whether science can finally explain what it is. For years, the Mesa has offered investigators the same cruel bargain. It gives them just enough evidence to keep looking. A strange signal, an unexpected drilling result, a fragment of unusual material, a subsurface anomaly. Then, just when the evidence seems close to an answer, the mountain becomes silent again. That is what makes the story so compelling. Because despite the dramatic claims surrounding Skinwalker Ranch, the strongest conclusion is not that Travis Taylor has proven an extraterrestrial spacecraft is buried inside the Mesa. He hasn't. No intact UFO has been publicly recovered. No extraterrestrial technology has been independently confirmed. And no experiment has established that the strange materials came from another world. But that doesn't mean nothing happened. Something genuinely unusual was investigated. The team encountered an underground target that they believed behaved differently from the surrounding rock. They recovered metallic fragments and later investigated ceramic material that they considered unusual. Radar surveys produced subsurface anomalies that researchers interpreted as possible buried structures. History has documented these investigations across multiple seasons. History.com. And that leaves us with a mystery that is more scientifically interesting than the simple headline. Because the real question isn't, did Travis Taylor find a UFO? The real question is, what produced the evidence inside the Mesa? If the fragments are ordinary terrestrial material, then identifying their source could explain one of the ranch's most famous mysteries. If the ceramic has a conventional industrial origin, finding that origin would be equally important. If the radar anomalies are geological, then understanding the geology could reveal why the Mesa repeatedly produces such unusual signals. But if independent laboratories eventually reproduce the reported material properties and determine that the samples cannot be explained by known terrestrial processes, the implications would become much larger. Not necessarily aliens, something more fundamental, an unknown technology, an unknown manufacturing process, or perhaps a physical phenomenon that scientists have never properly understood. That is why skepticism does not destroy the mystery, it strengthens it. Because a mystery that survives attempts to explain it is far more interesting than a mystery protected from testing. And Skinwalker Ranch has provided exactly that tension. Every extraordinary possibility has to compete against an ordinary explanation. The UFO theory competes with geology. The strange material competes with industrial manufacturing. The aerial sightings compete with aircraft, satellites, atmospheric effects, and misidentification. The electromagnetic anomalies compete with equipment interference and environmental sources. And the underground structures compete with the complexity of the Mesa itself. That battle between possibilities is where the real story lives. Maybe the mountain is hiding a machine. Maybe it is hiding nothing artificial at all. Maybe the truth is somewhere between those extremes. Perhaps the mesa contains several unrelated objects left behind by humans, natural formations that resemble engineered structures, and materials that become extraordinary only when removed from their geological context. Or perhaps researchers really are standing at the edge of something genuinely unknown. We simply don't know yet, and that uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the reason the investigation matters, because science has never advanced by declaring the answer before the evidence arrives. It advances when someone looks at an impossible-looking result and asks a better question. Travis Taylor's investigation of the Mesa has done exactly that. It transformed a legend into a physical target. It put instruments against rumors. It put drilling equipment against speculation. It put laboratory analysis against stories that had circulated for years. And the mountain still hasn't surrendered its deepest secret. That may be the most unsettling part. Somewhere beneath the rock is an answer. Whether that answer is a spacecraft, a geological structure, an abandoned human artifact, or something nobody has yet considered, the Mesa doesn't care what we want it to be. It simply waits. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden beneath all the strange lights and impossible stories surrounding Skinwalker Ranch. The unknown does not become less frightening when we investigate it. Sometimes, investigation makes the mystery bigger, because every answer can create another question. The metallic fragments raise the question of their source. The ceramic raises the question of its purpose. The underground anomaly raises the question of its origin, and the possibility of a connection between the ground and the sky raises the most extraordinary question of all. What if the Mesa isn't the end of the mystery, but the doorway to understanding it? For now, there is no scientific evidence strong enough to declare that an alien spacecraft is buried beneath Skinwalker Ranch. But there is enough evidence to justify asking what is really inside that mountain. And until someone reaches the object, documents it completely, preserves its context, and allows independent scientists to examine the evidence, the headline remains a question rather than a fact. Maybe that's what makes the story so powerful. Not knowing, standing at the edge of an answer and realizing that the distance between mystery and discovery can be only a few hundred feet of rock. If you enjoyed this investigation, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the Mesa contains something artificial, or do you think geology can explain what the researchers found? And if you want more deep investigations into the world's strangest mysteries, make sure to like the video and subscribe, because sometimes the most frightening discovery isn't finding something we cannot explain. It's realizing that we may have been looking in the wrong place all along.